is the question, what do all these have in common? Anti-apartheid activists in South Africa in the 1980s. That bloke who bombed abortion clinics and murdered their staff back in the 1990s. President George W. Bush as he began the war on terror back in the early noughties. Extinction Rebellion activists planning civil disobedience events much more recently. The pro-Trump campaign among most US Christians last year. The anti-Trump campaign among other US Christians even now. What do you think? Quite a variety of different causes and campaigns and ideologies there. What have they all got in common? Well, you can probably guess, given the subject for this evening. But yes, all of them looked to the same long-dead Christian pastor to provide justification for the actions and the positions that they were taking. Dietrich Bonhoeffer has been the poster boy of so many different campaigns over the years. It's hard to keep track of them all. But maybe it's not that hard to see why. It is quite a story. On the 9th of April 1945 in Flossenburg concentration camp, just 2 weeks before the camp was liberated, Bonhoeffer was hanged by piano wire. Not quite sure how or why that particular details come down to us, but there it is. Why was he hanged? Well, it was really a state execution for his links to an assassination plot on Adolf Hitler a year earlier. It's one of 20 attempts actually on Hitler's life, but they all failed, but this one came the closest. What happened was that the resistance movement had planted a bomb in a briefcase and managed to smuggle the briefcase into a room where Hitler himself was present. The hitch came when the briefcase was moved away from Hitler just a few minutes before it went off, which meant his aides got killed rather than the man himself. I think the reason so many are fascinated with Bonhoeffer is this journey he's taken, this normally peaceful guy, this pastor, just getting on with life like Peter Parker, Clark Kent, Bruce Banner, is transformed by the presence of a terrible evil into someone totally different. An assassin, or at least one who consorts with assassins. That is, the situation has become so extraordinary that normal rules are suspended. Civil disobedience, perhaps violence, is now an option even for a good, peace-loving person, a humble pastor for goodness sake, like Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So it's no great surprise that so many causes and campaigns have dug him up, as it were. What's going on? Well, what's going on is that they're seeking to lay claim to his legacy in order to provide moral authority for getting their hands dirty in their fight, whatever that fight is. The situation in the world is facing the threat of Islamic fundamentalism, or the catastrophe of mass immigration, or the horror of another runway to be built at Heathrow Airport, or whatever it is. It's just so appalling that the rules no longer apply. Desperate times call for desperate measures. Just look at Bonhoeffer. That's the line. In fact, over the past decade, this phrase has become quite popular in America. A Bonhoeffer moment. Don't know if you've heard it yourself. So it's like a catch cry, really, for anyone who wants to say, it's time to get our hands dirty. This is a Bonhoeffer moment. But is that really the legacy that Bonhoeffer provides for us as Christians today? If you go to Westminster Abbey in London, you'll see above the main west door, that's the main entrance, a series of 10 statues of 20th century modern martyrs from around the world. when the abbey was built, well, that part of the abbey was built back in the 15th century, those plinths were left empty. And it was deemed that by the end of the 20th century, the time had come to fill them. So 10 statues of 20th century martyrs, people like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Oscar Romero. The message seems to be these 10 men stand as modern day equivalents to those characters back in Hebrews chapter 11, the heroes of faith, people of whom it can be said, in the words of that reading that we heard a little bit from in the prayer, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles. And let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. In other words, they are inspirations. They're not perfect models, but inspirations. Inspirations to follow Jesus just as they did. That's the message. And among those 10, above the west door, stands none other than Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So as we approach the 80th anniversary of his death next month, the launch of this new movie this week, what does he have to teach us about Christian discipleship? Let me suggest just a few things. First up, he demonstrated the courage of genuine Christian discipleship. The courage of genuine Christian discipleship. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was born in 1906. He was the son of one of the leading psychologists in Germany. Lived his childhood against the backdrop of the First World War, but it was after the war, in his early teens, that he announced his intention, slightly precociously, to become a theologian. Not a pastor, a theologian. His parents were pretty unimpressed. I thought it was a complete waste of his talents, but they made it possible, and he was a bright kid. By the age of 24, he'd gained not one, but 2 PhDs. Anybody got 2 PhDs here by the age of 24? One in philosophy, one in theology. After he was done, he spent a year doing further studies in New York, much of which he found quite tedious, actually. But over that Christmas break, this is now 1930-31, he travelled down through the American South with one of his new mates, and he saw the treatment of black people in the South. And what that little trip did for him was to give him a kind of new eyes to see what was really happening back home in Germany with the Jewish community. He saw the evils of anti-Semitism. Now, he was a convinced pacifist. He didn't believe in violence of any kind. But just because he was a pacifist didn't mean he was going to be passive as he went home to Germany after that year. He set his course of action, actually in an early sermon. Faith entails decision, he preached. Repeated that line a number of times, I think. I think it's fair to say he practiced what he preached. When Hitler came to power in 1933, Bonhoeffer saw the threat he posed. He saw the threat to the nation. And he spoke up just 2 days after Hitler became Chancellor. Bonhoeffer took to the radio and warned the country about descending into a cult of the Führer. The transmission was cut off mid-sentence. It was a dangerous thing to say, but it needed to be said, he felt. He saw the threat to Jewish people, and he took action, started to help Jewish people to escape across the border to Switzerland. And he spurred on others to action too. He famously said, one of his most famous quotes actually, the church must not simply bandage the victims under the wheel, but jam a spoke in the wheel itself. See what he's doing there? He's calling for opposition, out and out opposition to the state policy of persecuting the Jews. Again, a dangerous course of action, but someone needed to do it. Someone needed to go there, he felt. And actually he saw the threat to the church. To his horror, the mainstream national church decided to endorse the Nazi party. In fact, they started calling themselves the Reichskirche, the Church of the Reich. And they didn't stop there. I mean, Christian nationalism is a thing around the world in some places from time to time, and it's very big in the US just at the moment. You even have the Patriot Church movement over there. It's pretty scary stuff, actually. But in 1930s Germany, it was worse. Their synod formally accepted Hitler's famous Aryan paragraph, basically saying that all clergy with any Jewish blood in them should be stripped of their office. Well, that was it for Bonhoeffer. As far as he was concerned, it was no longer a genuine church. They'd lost the gospel. They were serving the Führer, not Jesus. So what did he do? He stepped up, became one of the leaders of a new alliance of churches known as the Confessing Church, which sought to remain faithful to the gospel. He even founded and led one of 5 underground seminaries to train gospel-faithful pastors. Again, he was putting himself in danger by all this illegal activity as it soon became pronounced. But the good of the church came first. But more even than that, he saw the threat to the future. In the late 30s, he was, unsurprisingly, stripped of his professorial chair. He was a university lecturer. He had his license to teach removed. And so he was very much on the radar of the SS. And then to cap it all, as war loomed, he was in danger of being conscripted into the army, which you can imagine for a pacifist like him would have been just unthinkable. And of course, refusing the draft wasn't just a nice conscientious subject kind of thing. It was a capital offence. So when he had the opportunity to go back to New York, invited by his friends over there in America to sit out the war, as it were, he took it. But not for long. Even as he sailed into New York, he realised it was a mistake. And he immediately booked a ticket on the next ship back, which turned out to be the very last passenger ship that crossed the Atlantic, given all the German U-boats that were prowling now. His reason for turning around? He needed to prepare for the future, whatever the cost to himself. He wrote in a letter that week, "I must live through this difficult period in our national history along with the people of Germany. I'll have no right to participate in the reconstruction of Christian life in Germany after the war if I do not share the trials of this time with my people." See, the future of the gospel in Germany outweighed the risk to his personal life. You see what I'm saying about his courage? He just did what needed to be done. He put the good of others, the Jewish people, the church, the nation, the future of the gospel, ahead of his own interests. And that's what discipleship meant for him. And not giving in to fear. And doing the right thing with little regard to the consequences. As Christians who know God are uniquely placed to do. He was becoming a living reenactment of the spirit of David in Psalm 27. Do you remember those words? "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid?" I wonder if any of us find that attitude a challenge. I certainly do. It's so easy to give in to fear, isn't it? To avoid risk as much as we possibly can. To hold off making decisions when we don't know what the consequences might be. Popular psychology allows us to write off that kind of stuff without any problems. I'm just not that kind of person. I'm risk averse by temperament or by personality, and that's just who I am, so it's fine. Well, maybe. But maybe not. Maybe it's not fine. Maybe maybe it's actually just a statement of refusing to really entrust ourselves to God. Maybe it's a decision to prioritize our own comfort, our own security, over the people around us in the cause of Christ. It's challenging. But while we're pondering that, let's look at a second way, a slightly different way, that Bonhoeffer might get under our skin. It's the way he points to the community of discipleship. I mentioned earlier that Bonhoeffer led that underground seminary, a place called Finkenwalde. And his time there was a precious time for him, living in that beautiful seminary community like that. And it was there that he wrote one of his two most influential books. It's called Life Together. And for anyone who really cares about the quality of relationships in a church community, as we certainly do as a church, it makes for powerful reading, transformative reading, in fact. Let me bring out just a few of the things that he says in that little book. He talks, for one thing, about the sheer privilege of Christian community. Remember the backdrop of life in Germany? It was a world that was going crazy. And so he was aware of the potential for everything normal to be taken away in a moment. You might all be sent to prison or anything could happen. But what he says is that thought, that possibility, should focus your mind on what you have with your fellow believers. Therefore, let him who until now has had the privilege of living a common Christian life with other Christians praise God's grace from the bottom of his heart. Let him thank God on his knees and declare, it is grace, nothing but grace, that we are allowed to live in community with Christian brethren. I wonder if that's how you feel, how we feel about Christian community, about church. Are we complacent about it? Take it for granted? Or are we on our knees every day before God, thanking him for what we have here? But he doesn't stop there. He goes on to warn about our motivations for seeking Christian community. This is quite, this is interesting. It is possible, he says, to be fundamentally selfish in your reasons for choosing to hang out with others at church. You're fed up of doing life on your own. Something's missing in life for you. Life is lacking in some way. You need some kind of meaning. And so what do? You choose to join in with the Christian community. But you see what you're doing, and fundamentally it's just for your own good. Whoever does this, he says, is really not seeking community at all, but only distraction, which will allow him to forget his loneliness for a brief time. In fact, he says, if this is your motivation, you'll end up clinging to people and effectively trying to control them. He makes the point by contrasting two kinds of love. And there's human love on the one hand. Human love seeks direct contact with the other person. It loves him not as a free person, but as one whom it binds to itself. It wants to gain, to capture by every means. It uses force. It desires to be irresistible, to rule. In other words, you might simply say it's a me-centered kind of relationship. And then he says, and there is spiritual love, which is a kind of Christ-centered relationship. How does spiritual love work? It knows that it has no immediate access to other persons. Jesus Christ stands between the lover and the others he loved. That might be quite an eye-opener to some of us, I suspect. Why are you here this evening? If it's not too personal a question. What's really driving you when you meet together in a small group? Or whatever it is. Is it about using them or loving them? So there's the privilege of community and the motivations for it. But much of the book is given over to working out what the engine is for community. Where does the real power come for engaging in community? It actually comes, he says, to start with at least, in each person's private devotional life. Which is not where you might have thought he'd go to start with. Now, praying about your own concerns when you spend time in prayer, it's not enough. You need to be interceding for others. Because when you do intercede for others, that ends up actually changing the way that you conduct your relationships with them. Apart from anything else, it's hard to stay irritated with someone when you're regularly praying for them. I can no longer condemn or hate a brother for whom I pray, then no matter how much trouble he causes me. There's no dislike, no personal tension, no estrangement that cannot be overcome by intercession, as far as our side of it is concerned. But there's another thing that acts as the kind of engine for relationships. It's about being determined to see each and every person, whatever their quirks and irritations or whatever it is, as a human being made in the image of God. That image, he says, always manifests a completely new and unique form that comes solely from God's free and sovereign creation. When you learn to see people like that, he says, you find yourself rejoicing in them. Because, hey, here is another reflection of God himself. And you find yourself wanting to listen to them and to be patient with them, to look after them, to love them. Because in a sense, they are Christ himself to you. Matthew 25, verse 40. Now you see what he's doing in all this. He's building on his experience of that underground seminary there. But also on the insecurity of the situation that meant it could all be taken away. And he's doing it to encourage us to focus on what we have. We're not just a bunch of lone rangers just interacting with others on our own terms as far as it suits us. No, church community means each of us being owned by each other. Paul's language, Romans 12. For just as each of us has one body with many members, those members do not have all the same function, so in Christ, we, though many, form one body, and each member belongs to all the others. So how do we think of our place in church? Belonging to each other? Or are we more transactional? More, dare I say it, Trumpian? I'll do this for you, but only if you do that for me. The community of discipleship. And one last thing which we have to visit. Bonhoeffer also famously stressed the cost of discipleship. When he returned to Germany at the start of the war, he was invited to join the Abwehr, the intelligence service, the equivalent, I suppose, of the MI5, the CIA, something like that. It worked really well for them because over the past years, Bonhoeffer had picked up a whole lot of contacts internationally through his church work. So he could use those contacts to spread the message, to boost Germany's image and maybe find out more about what the world was planning for Germany. But it worked for him too, perhaps even better. Partly because it meant he wouldn't have to fight on the front line, which would go against his conscience. But there was something else. He got to play the role of double agent. See, deep inside the Abwehr was an unofficial movement which was committed to overthrowing Hitler. It was a resistance movement with the best possible cover right inside the Pentagon, you might say. And so what Bonhoeffer was able to do was visit those international contacts of his, supposedly on solid German intelligence business. But in fact, what he was up to was trying to get the resistance message out to them. Don't worry, everyone. There is a resistance movement in Berlin. We are going to get rid of Hitler. But when we do, we need to know that you've got our backs and you'll support our new government. Spread the word quietly. Now, eventually, the Gestapo caught up with him. He was arrested in 1943 for misusing his position and his travels. But it wasn't that serious. He'd covered his tracks fairly well for his extracurricular activity. A year later, though, when that briefcase assassination attempt was made, the Abwehr was searched from top to bottom by the SS. It was like the Secret Service, I suppose, auditing the CIA. And in one file, a document was found that linked Bonhoeffer's name to others who were involved in the attempt. It was thin, but it was enough to see Bonhoeffer executed. Now, it's still debated how much Bonhoeffer actually knew about the attempt. He may not have known anything, or he may have known a lot. But he paid the price for the general project he was a part of, as of course he knew he might do one day. But here's the thing. What he faced there, getting killed for doing the right Christian thing as he saw it, it was in effect what he had said years previously every Christian ought to do at some level. I mentioned earlier on that work he'd done on the Sermon on the Mount after he returned from America got published as The Cost of Discipleship. And what made him write was a concern he had that in the Christian world, grace and discipleship had become, as he put it, cheap and watered down. Oh, if I sin, it's not really a biggie, I'll just get forgiven. Not a problem. It's that kind of attitude he was concerned about. So what he said was, we've got to move away from that kind of cheap grace to what he called costly grace. Cheap grace is the preaching of forgiveness without requiring repentance. A baptism without church discipline. A grace without discipleship. Grace without the cross. Grace without Jesus Christ. Costly grace is the treasure hidden in the field. For the sake of it, a man will gladly go and sell all that he has. It's the kingly rule of Christ, for whose sake a man will pluck out the eye which causes him to stumble. It's the call of Jesus Christ at which the disciple leaves his nets and follows him. Costly grace. When Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die. And so he goes on in the book, he talks about stuff we accumulate. Earthly goods are given not to be used, are given to be used, not to be collected. Talks about looking down on other people. By judging others, we blind ourselves to our own evil and to the grace which others are just as entitled to as we are. Talks about reining in our instincts. Strict exercise of self-control is an essential feature of the Christian's life. This is costly grace, as he puts it. It's actually exactly the kind of grace that the Apostle Paul talks about. You've read his letter to Titus. Remember that? Titus chapter 2. For the grace of God has appeared that offers salvation to all people. It teaches us to say no to ungodliness and worldly passions, and to live self-controlled, upright, and godly lives in this present age. Titus chapter 2. Verse 11 to 14. And in fact, it's just this kind of grace that Jesus himself was driving at when he said he was going to the cross, but then immediately followed up by saying these words: "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will save it." What good is it for someone to gain the whole world and yet lose or forfeit their very self? Whoever is ashamed of me and my words, the Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes in his glory, in the glory of the Father and of the holy angels. I wonder if you and I know much about this kind of costly grace, like taking up our cross as we follow Jesus. Or we must leave it there. But as we do, let me say, please don't get me wrong about Bonhoeffer. He is not the man to go to for clear explanation of biblical truth. He was a man of his times, and that meant that his theology was shaped by the agenda of 19th and early 20th century German philosophical theology. And that did not serve him well, any more than it would serve you or me well. It meant he missed all sorts of big things. He missed the clear teaching of the Bible about the cross, about who will be saved, about how to make godly decisions, about whether you can really trust the words of the Bible are true. He's not clear on those things, not by a long shot. But these three things: real courage, deep community, the cost of discipleship, they are areas where I do think he has much to teach us. We've learned about some really helpful things, I think, some challenges from what we've heard of the life and the teaching of Bonhoeffer. We've heard about his courage, the way he spoke up, the way he stepped up, and the way he trained up future ministers, the way he turned around at one point for the sake of the future. Learned about community and the way he highlighted the privilege of Christian community. It was a gift. The way he shone a light on the proper motivations for community life. It wasn't just to fill a hole in yourself, it's about others. And the way he spoke about the power of the community life, interceding for others, seeing the image of God in others. And we've seen something about the cost, taking up our cross as we follow Jesus.